right. So the test is called GI Map that we're going to be talking about today, but the company is Diagnostic Solutions. And I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit more about the history of the company and the development of this test.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's funny, I mentored with Dr. Dan Kalish, and I found out about the test even before the lab had opened its doors. So he was kind of I think a beta tester for the lab, and so he has connections, and so he was getting some test kits to try out on patients before it was even available. And so, during my classes with him, he was really speaking highly of the lab and saying how it's finding all these infections and everything with people, and really exciting stuff on the test. And so I couldn't wait for the lab to open its doors and start accepting people and start running the test. And so I was, probably one of the first people to sign up as soon as they were open to clinicians opening accounts. And so I, use it on myself. I use it on clients, and it's something I just started using as a clinician long before I actually started working for the lab and then becoming an advisor. But it is more because I found such great results with the test that I really wanted to be a clinician to help walk doctors through the lab report, because it is, as you know, a very complex test report, lots of different markers. So, educating clinicians on lab interpretation is really one of my favorite things. So I really love doing that. So, what's different about this test that, made it a really new, innovative thing, option for clinicians was the technology used. The GI map uses what's called qPCR, or quantitative polymerase chain reaction is what qPCR stands for. And, a lot of the, testing methods used in the past were more what's called ONP. O is ova, P is parasites, so ova and parasites. So that's the test you think of that's been used for, I don't know, many, many decades, where basically you get the stool sample and then you have a lab technician who's analyzing slides from the stool sample underneath the microscope and trying to identify things visually of what, it's like, okay, well, this looks like this, so that must be, this organism because it resembles it. Now, those were highly dependent on the skill of the technician looking at the slides of the stool. And unfortunately, a lot of technicians are not really trained in parasite identification these days. Because really, in conventional medicine, they don't give a lot of weight to pathogens. They think that, well, unless you lived in a third world country or, you've traveled to a third world country, we don't have parasites here in the US. So, why bother training people on identifying them? So it's hard to find people, expert parasitologists who can look at slides and really identify things. So that was one of the issues with the OMPs was, they would miss a lot of things because people just haven't had the proper training, or they misidentify things. A undigested bean sprout can actually look like several different parasites. So you could, and that's where some of these would come back and say, oh, we think it's a parasite, and maybe it wasn't. So we can have maybe some false positives, false negatives. Not the best way of testing nowadays, now that we have this advanced technology, but back in the day, that's kind of what we had. And then culture, when we're looking at yeast and bacteria, culture was predominantly used. So culture is, you're taking the organisms in the stool, feeding them these different substrates to make them grow, and then identifying what is cultured out. Now, there are, again, major downsides to this in that, bacteria can be classified as aerobes, which means they like oxygen, and anaerobes, meaning they don't like oxygen. And the problem is when you're culturing things out, you don't really get the anaerobes culturing because they don't like oxygen. And so, the anaerobes make up like 90 to 95% of the bacteria. So when you're culturing, you're missing the vast majority of these bacteria and different organisms. And that's assuming that, by the time you pooped in the container, shipped it by UPS or FedEx to the lab, they've processed it, it cultures out, that's assuming that some of them survived to actually grow out in the first place. So there's a lot of ifs there, and they're missing a lot of things. So that's what made the GI map so exciting when it
Yeah, a
came
lot of
on the
variables. That was
scene.
super helpful to hear all
Yeah.
that. Thank you.
So now we're doing a DNA analysis, and that's what makes this testing so revolutionary and so exciting, is that we can actually, identify these organisms without a doubt. I mean, there's no case of mistaken identity. A bean sprout cannot masquerade as a parasite because, we're looking for that exact DNA match. So that it has to be that exact DNA like fingerprint to match that organism and only that organism. The organisms may be shed at different rates, and so sometimes there's not a whole lot of DNA to pick up. Is that what, or not a lot of organisms to pick up in general?
This test, it can kind of multiply that DNA, so it is possible to find it. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah. I mean, some of these organisms, like H. pylori, it actually originates from the stomach in most cases. That's where it's the area of infection. So when we're measuring it in the stool, that's a distance between the stomach and, coming out the other end. So you don't typically find a whole lot of H. pylori in the stool to begin with. Now, the GI map can find as few as 10 bacterial cells of H. pylori per gram of stool. So it can go down that low to find these. But some of these pathogens, and that's where they've done research studies comparing different methodologies, and some of these parasites are really hard to find in the stool, like Giardia is one example. Before the PCR testing, I mean, I hardly ever saw any tests coming back positive for Giardia, just because there's not a whole lot of them. That one, again, is going to live a little higher up in the small intestine. So you may not have quite as many coming out in the stool. And then there's a thought that some of these pathogens, the second they leave the body, may produce these self-digesting enzymes. So they're essentially breaking
Oh,
themselves
wow.
down into little pieces. And again, of course, ONP, ova and parasite, the microscopic examination, is reliant upon there being like a whole parasite body there that you can see and identify. So if you have like a little leg here, a little head there, a little foot there, it can't identify it. Versus the DNA, when you think of like crime scene analysis, the DNA analysis, I mean, all you need is someone's hair, a fingernail, a skin fragment, so it's the same thing here, where you just need a piece of it to identify it. You don't need that whole intact organism. So something like Giardia in the research studies, they found like your standard microscopic analysis is finding, I can't remember how the percentages were just so different. I mean, it's like missing it the majority. I mean, over 50% of the time, you're not going to find it under the microscope. But compared with the PCR has a much, much higher rate of detection.
Okay. So Lou Ann asked earlier, how accurate is the parasite testing?
Mm-hmm.
And is there, like, can you say kind of a percentage, or is it just kind of hard to say?
Yeah, well, in the head-to-head studies, a lot of it depends on the certain organisms too. Some organisms, like there's a really nasty parasite called Entamoeba histolytica, and that one, again, short of doing like a qPCR, PCR type test on it, you're really not going to find it.
Okay.
There's like an old time doctor I know of in New York who does like a fecal swab. So he's doing like a Q-tip up your butt and then putting it on a
Oh,
slide
wow.
immediately. And he was one who could find this. But short of that, it just doesn't get found by normal testing methods. Or things like, the Giardia cryptosporidium. I mean, just really, really hard to find in like an OMP. And so when they've done head-to-head studies, the PCR or qPCR versus OMP, with staining and everything else that they can do with the microscopic analysis. The percentage that they can find, they have a sample that they know has Giardia, and so then they send it to different labs to test it. And the qPCR is finding these things at a such higher percentage rate than your standard OMP.
Okay. So SJ was asking, is this the same as Genova? But Genova is a different company. How long has GI Map been around?
Yeah, I believe it was, let's see, I think it's 2015. So I'm thinking, because I know it's like I ran my first test with them almost as soon as it came out, and I think it was back 2015. So good
Okay.
5 years or so.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, some of the other tests, because qPCR, PCR is now being used more in the research because they know it is, so excellent at identifying pathogens. A lot of these other tests are maybe starting to use PCR, like adding in a few little PCR markers to the test, especially for some of the parasites. But what makes, again, the GI map a little different than those is, the majority of the test is qPCR, other than there's, like calprotectin and elastase, markers for inflammation and digestive enzyme production, that's a different kind of technology. But all of the organisms, whether it's bacteria, yeast, H. pylori, parasites, worms, all of that is DNA analysis. And then that's quantitative PCR. So quantitative PCR, what I like about that is it tells you the number of organisms. And so you can see, sometimes maybe you don't get rid of a parasite, but at least you can compare the apples and go, or kind of compare apples to apples and go, well, we started out with this many organisms, we started out with 5,000 organisms, and now we're down to, 600. Maybe not completely negative, but that's great progress. Versus the regular PCR is more just positive, negative. So
Oh, okay.
the lab has their own cutoff, and they just tell you if it exceeded that or not. Now, as a clinician, I want to know numbers. I want the lab to give me the data so I can make the clinical decision of whether I think that that's relevant, given the client's symptoms, given their history, given what else is showing up on the report. Again, something like Giardia, really nasty bug that can cause, malabsorption in your small intestine. You could see diarrhea, a bunch of really horrible, severe symptoms. You could be just below that threshold and the lab will say negative. But if I have the number with a qPCR, I can look at that and go, okay, it was detected. Really, we shouldn't have any Giardia in the system at all.
Right.
And this is really close to being a really relevant level, like a high positive. That's something I'm going to address. So I want the qPCR because I want those numbers.
Yeah, and that's what I do with parasites and H. pylori, and I can't recall if anything else on your test, but I'm like, if we're detecting a parasite at any amount and you're paying for this test, you probably have some issues. So like let's treat it. And then H. pylori, you could debate it, right? A lot of us have H. pylori, but again, if you're having some level of H. pylori and enough digestive issues that you scheduled for this test, I don't want that H. pylori to grow, inhibit proper stomach acid. So I enjoy it as a practitioner too, seeing the levels, and I'll explain them when we do testing. It always comes with a consultation, so we'll just go through every section and walk you through it and say, oh, this is my rationale on this is my rationale on that. And to me, it's fascinating for everyone involved to get that much information about what's going on in your own gut.
Exactly. Yeah. You want as many, a lot of people are dealing with chronic health issues that have been going on many years or
Right.
decades. So it's like, I want to know as much data as I possibly can.
Yeah, and as we said in your health history story, it's so common that not only do you have gut issues, but you've got Lyme, or toxic mold is really common in our community, or hormonal issues. So to me, you really want to optimize that gut because it's going to have just such an important trickle down to other systems being stronger and getting the nutrients you need. So yeah, I love it. I mean, we have a lot of great tests we offer, and obviously depending on the case, kind of where you should start. But to me, like, everyone's going to benefit from running a GI map, because it's so, your gut is so foundational to your health. And I don't know if anyone has ever come back like, just, some people come back pretty clearer than I expected, but there's usually some interesting stuff to find on every test. And you've looked at what, hundreds or thousands of them, which must be so fascinating. Are there any kind of trends you want to share with us and looking at so many?
Yeah, I mean, it's fun to see. I mean, I kind of keep a mental note of, certain diets, if the practitioner knows what particular diet the patient is on, to correlate that with the test results to see, okay, a lot of people have SIBO, so they're on like an SCD diet, low FODMAP diet, what are we seeing for, the bacteria and yeast and everything else with that kind of diet, or keto or carnivore, or, someone who's maybe vegetarian, or, it's interesting to see those patterns, or IBS, IBD. The clinical team at the lab is always trying to see if there's, different correlations, both in the research and then what we're observing too on the backside. Because sometimes you can see these little patterns, and it's really fascinating where, some diets, that they're really popular, but when we look at the microbiome, they're maybe not the best for the microbiome. Even though, yes, maybe they're helping people lose weight or temporarily helping with some of their symptoms. I'd rather, let's deal with the pathogens, the dysbiosis, clear those out, and so you can allow more foods into your diet and feed your microbiome, versus just taking away all the possible food sources for these bacteria, getting the temporary symptom relief without really solving that root cause.
That's an interesting point. Yeah, we definitely encouraging more diversity of diet, and in our business, in our practice. I just had a client. I'll share a quick story. He's been dealing with loose stool for like 30 years. Did live overseas, did get treated for all sorts of things, all sorts of protocols, but kind of got on that limited diet. And even before he ran a GI map, he was starting to take some pre-fibers and have more diversity, he was really working for him. So I really like people seeing that and knowing that. Kim asked if there's any provoking agents that can make parasites more likely to show up on the test.
Yeah, there's several different opinions by clinicians. It's hard to say how, if these really increase the ability to find these organisms, but biofilm disruptors are one thing to consider. A lot of these are different enzymes that, a biofilm is kind of like a slimy shield that can protect these organisms. So if they're safe underneath their little shield, they may not be, shed in the stool to then pick up in the test. So some people will use these biofilm disrupting, maybe for a week, possibly 2 before doing the sample collection, in hopes that it will break down those shields to see the organisms. Now, maybe it helps, maybe it doesn't. It's really hard to say for sure, or maybe in some cases, it depends if a particular individual has a lot of biofilm producing microbes or not. Now, the issue we can run into is some people do not tolerate those products very well, or it's kind of like, if you think of the biofilm disruptors as you're kind of opening the jail cells and you're letting all the criminals loose. If you don't have agents on hand to kill those criminals as they get out, they can wreak a lot of havoc. So that one gets a little iffy, because we don't really want people getting sick just in order to test them. So that's one thought. Another thing is, sometimes there's the thought that pathogens, parasites, are more active around the full moon. So if there's, say, a full moon coming up, maybe you time your collection, shortly before, during, or after the full moon. Again, we don't know, does it make a lot of difference? But it could be one of those things where, again, maybe you try it just in case.
Yeah, yeah, I would agree with all that. We don't particularly say full moon, but I think that is documented that they're more active. We did used to do a biofilm disruptor, but it would slow everything down. It would, kind of make you nauseous potentially. And when I
Yeah.
called your lab, they're just like, no, you don't you don't really need it. So I was like, let's just
Yeah.
take it out. We find plenty in the results, and we don't have
Mhm.
anybody doing a bio. We run a lot of these, so
Yeah.
I don't think it's necessary. One thing I say, and I don't know if you agree, Lisa, is like it's only testing for what, about 12 total worms and parasites. So there are some that it could not get because it just didn't test for that type of one, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, that's, the only downside to PCR testing is that you do have to predetermine what organisms you're going to look for on the panel. So, I mean, yeah, there are like 5 worms, I think, on the panel. So yeah, you could have some really exotic tapeworm from India or something that maybe that's not tested for on the panel because it's not really that common in the US. So yeah, something like that could be missed where, that could be a case where if you can find an expert parasitologist to analyze a stool, maybe that could pick up some of those exotic things. Now, I mean, we do have a lot of the clinically relevant organisms, so like all the common protozoa, the H. pylori, the very common worms. But yeah, I mean, there is that thought that, there could be some other things. Biofilms are more some of the bacteria, like H. pylori can be a biofilm producer, Pseudomonas can be a biofilm producer. But, a lot of it, the parasites, they could maybe live within a biofilm, but, not always the biggest biofilm producers. So you're often, and this is again a strength of the DNA analysis, where you can go down to such small levels. So yes, you may have some things hidden in biofilms, but you're also having some just shed that are more freely floating in the gut that go down. And again, with the DNA, it can pick up those lower levels. So it makes that biofilm agent maybe less necessary than if you were doing the old OMPs, where maybe you can't go down to those smaller levels.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, if you did live somewhere real particular, I think you got exposed to something very particular. I had a client once seeing things passed across her field of vision, and there's that there's all sorts of weird stuff out there like parasites. Um, so there going to be a time to go to a special parasitology clinic. But I agree with you too that there's just such a broad range of like the heavy hitters on this test. And occasionally I have a client who doesn't have all that many infections, just maybe a little bacterial overgrowth, but
Mhm.
I can still see, their mucosal lining is completely beat down, or they're,
Mhm.
not digesting fats well, or whatever. So we always got some information to go on, which maybe takes me to the next question, which is backing it up a bit.
Mhm.
Who's a good candidate for this test?
Yeah, I mean, for me, everyone, because I think,
Yeah,
just like,
to be honest, yes.
yeah, yeah. I mean, like the old saying, Hippocrates is credited with saying all disease begins in the gut. So for me, a stool test is my foundational test. It's one of the first ones I want to see on everyone. Now, I mean, certainly if there's any kind of gut related symptoms, whether it's gas, bloating, constipation, diarrhea, pain, food kind of sitting like a rock in the stomach, or any of those things, I mean, it's kind of a no brainer in those cases. But other things too, I mean, we see the research linking like skin issues. Just the other day, I was reading a link between low akkermansia, which is a certain kind of beneficial microbe, low akkermansia and psoriasis. H. pylori has been linked with rosacea and psoriasis and a bunch of different skin conditions. Blasto has been, which is a parasite, Blastocystis hominis, has been linked with chronic hives. So again, someone may not have any GI symptoms, but they have this chronic skin issue.
Mm,
Certain things have been linked with autoimmune disorders. So again, there may not be any GI issues, but they have Hashimoto's,
yes.
or they have rheumatoid arthritis, or, again, it comes back to the gut. So really, I say if there's any kind of chronic health issue, I think you should test this.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it would be, you could take any American off the street pretty much and get some interesting stuff, because we just, the way we're treating our bodies and our guts is pretty rough. We're
Mm-hmm.
exposed to so many antibacterial elements and pesticides. I mean, we also test for toxins in our practice, and you'd be shocked. You
Mm-hmm.
might not be shocked, Lisa,
Yeah.
but some people would be shocked the level of pesticides and things in a person's
Mm-hmm.
body, even when they're trying to eat organic, and that takes a toll on your microbiome. I think stress is
Mm-hmm.
really hurting our mucosal lining. I mean,
Definitely.
yeah, I don't know about you, Lisa. Like, I would say 95% of results come back with a low mucosal level, at least 90.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just like, man, this is like an epidemic.
Yeah, that secretory IgA, I mean, that's your gut immune system. You think of that as your first line of defense. I think of it like your army. If you have no army, or the army just isn't in fighting shape, how is it going to protect you when you get some E. coli on your hamburger, or some other little organism on your lettuce, or you swallow a parasite or something? We need that to be as strong as possible. And things like stress are known to decrease the secretory IgA. Could be, again, these organisms, and there's this kind of catch-22, this snowball effect where, maybe you have some pathogens and dysbiosis suppressing that gut immune response, and then you get more pathogens on top because you don't have a good immune system, and then they suppress it further, and you just can't dig yourself out of that hole.
Yeah. A lot of the stress is caused by just the pathogens themselves. So yeah, and I like you gave some examples about Hashimoto's or skin disorders. There's just so many good candidates, so to speak. And I would say another, sign you're a good candidate is that you want to actually take action based on the results. So, for instance, if I got my dad to run this test, which is a hard maybe, but if he did, would he really do all this protocol?
Mhm.
Also probably not. So, my audience is quite different than that. If you're here on this call, you're probably motivated to consider it. You may have already run some GI tests. You may have run a GI map a few years ago and didn't really get the right guidance on it. So you're an audience that's primed, so to speak. But unfortunately, it takes also that interest because what I don't want is people just get their results and be like, oh, that's interesting, and then you
Mhm.
know not do anything. And I really try to make the protocols gentle, as affordable as I can, also food based, lifestyle. But you got to do it, because these critters, aren't gonna just kill themselves spontaneously. And that's another
Yeah.
point I made, is like, you can say, oh well, I eat well and I do all this stuff. Yeah, but what
Mhm.
agent is going in there and actually killing these things? That takes some expertise and some very
Mhm.
directed activity that is just not going to happen when you're at
Mhm.
home just trying to eat clean or eat paleo. Would you agree with that point?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, diet can only do so much, and that's what we see on the report too. And it's hard to guess sometimes ahead of time. This person may have pathogens and a bunch of bacterial overgrowth and yeast, so maybe they need to do a little more killing. Versus someone else, maybe they're having, again, similar symptoms, but you look at their report and it's pretty clean as to what's overgrowing, or what, there's
Right.
not so much what doesn't belong, but they're lacking the beneficial microbes that should be there. And you can still end up with leaky gut, with inflammation in your gut, with other issues showing up because you're lacking the bacteria. So with that case, it's not so much killing, but it's the feeding. And that's where the diet really comes into play. But otherwise, if you're just thinking, well, I'm eating really healthy, so, it must be doing me good. It's like, well, if you have H. pylori, you probably have low stomach acid. So you're probably not getting a lot of benefit from your protein to break it down to your amino acids. You also have a really hard time absorbing your minerals, calcium, magnesium, zinc, when you have your stomach isn't acidic
Mm.
enough. We tend to see low iron, low B12 with H. pylori. So again, you could have all these symptoms, mood issues, fatigue, because you're not getting the nutrients because of this pathogen there. No matter how well you eat, you could be eating plenty plenty of like red meat, protein, and it's like your B12's low and your zinc's low. And you think, well, I don't understand it. I'm eating the foods that are high in zinc and that are high in protein. Why are my lab reports showing that those levels aren't good?
Yeah, that's a great point. Another thing I really try to emphasize in my education is digestion from the top down. Is your brain inflamed? Are you making saliva? Do you have stomach acid? Because the gut is, the large intestine is very sexy right now. The microbe is very sexy right now. But it really starts before that. Good digestion starts before that, which is why I pretty much always am going to go after H. pylori if I see it there, because I don't know how that's going to trend, and I don't want it to trend in the wrong direction. And especially there's other things, elements involved. So that was a great explanation. But I see some questions coming in, and yeah, just keep them coming. I think I'm just going to take them all in a minute. I wonder, Lisa, we've kind of hit on some things that are in the test, the H. pylori, some parasites, with a lack of a visual aid here, because we're going good now and I'm not going to mess it up by adding video. Could you just kind of hit the sections of the test and what people are going to find, and maybe a few markers you especially love?
Sure. Yeah. So the first page of the report is, pathogens that, there's really no argument by anyone, conventional medicine, functional medicine. These are things that do not belong in the body. We don't want to be seeing these things. And this is divided up into bacterial pathogens, parasitic pathogens, and viral pathogens. Now, some of these are more acute. So like enterohemorrhagic E. coli is one we see a lot of, kind of like a food poisoning bug, probably ate something, drank something within the last month or two. And so you may have that acute diarrhea, maybe even bloody stool, cramping, that sort of thing. So we are looking for, say someone has just noticed, the last month I've just had all sorts of diarrhea and loose stool. I don't know what's going on. This test not only can identify some of the more chronic pathogens and issues that can be occurring, but maybe something you just picked up recently too, that we can go, oh, well, that's why you had a little bit of this food poisoning bug. So, what do you eat? Can we work on food hygiene, food quality to try to prevent this? Or, what protective mechanism in the body failed to allow you to get the E. coli? What gave it that foothold? Do you also have H. pylori causing low stomach acid, so you couldn't kill it when you ate the lettuce that had the E. coli? Or do you have, low bile? Bile is an antimicrobial agent too. Or low enzymes to break down and digest the food well. Or that secretory IgA, do you have no gut immune system to go out and attack that? So that's at the first page. We're looking at some acute pathogens, but also some chronic. The parasites on there are the Giardia, the Cryptosporidium, the Entamoeba histolytica. Those are 3 very, very nasty little bugs. So I don't want to see any levels, any numbers for those. I want to see a less than DL, because they can cause problems, in even smaller amounts. So in really severe problems. So that's kind of page 1. We also have C. diff on there too, which, some people could have a C. diff infection. Other people are C. diff carriers, where they're colonized with C. diff. And again, this is something where, okay, you don't have the classic C. diff infection type symptoms, so it's not actively producing the toxins. However, if we pick the bacteria's DNA up, and that DNA that shows it's carrying those genes that are capable of producing the toxins, the C. diff could be lying in wait, waiting for the opportunity where you need antibiotics for a UTI, strep throat, you have some dental procedure and taking prophylactic antibiotics. If you kill the good bugs that are keeping that C. diff in check, now you actually could get a C. diff infection because you're already harboring it in your gut. So there's some really important things on page 1. Now, page 2, we have H. pylori, and not only do we test the H. pylori bacteria itself, so we're quantifying, how many cells of H. pylori were detected, but we also run what are called virulence factors. Now, these are things that tell you a little more about the pathogenic potential of that H. pylori. So are you at greater risk of developing gastric cancer, gastric ulcers, cardiovascular disease from your particular H. pylori? So again, something that we can do with the, the technology we're using that, other methods of testing for H. pylori aren't able to do. And I find that really valuable to know that too. Below the H. pylori on page 2, we have the beneficial flora. So now we're looking at the good guys, that have anti-inflammatory effects that protect us against leaky gut, that maybe, help produce different neurotransmitters and certain nutrients in our gut. So some really important things, and ones that people are familiar with are things like lactobacillus and bifidobacterium species. But then there are also some other what are called keystone species that are, a little more newly discovered and more, recently investigated to find out all the benefits that they have to us, like Akkermansia muciniphila and Faecalibacterium prausnitzii. So a lot of good bugs on this page, and we want them in that sweet spot, not too low and not too high. So either way, if it's too high or too low, we could see symptoms, maybe different symptoms, but still there can be negative impacts from if it's just out of balance one way or the other. Page 3 are a lot of the undesirable organisms. So these are some of the opportunistic bacteria that, you give them an inch, they'll take a mile. So, and some of these are potential autoimmune triggers. So if you have that perfect storm of, you have the genetic predisposition to, say, rheumatoid arthritis, plus you have an overgrowth of like Citrobacter or Klebsiella that have been known to trigger autoimmune issues like rheumatoid arthritis, and you have a leaky gut, those 3 things put together could mean there is a higher risk of you developing an autoimmune disorder. So I really like to see those. And then we also have a bunch of yeast and fungi on here. So like your Candida albicans, and some other yeasts that we can find in the gut that again can overgrow and create issues. And then we also have some viruses, Epstein-Barr virus, cytomegalovirus. Now, these are helpful on the report. People think, well, why is that on a gut panel? Well, both of those in the colon, when they're reactivated, have been linked with IBD. So they can be important for gut health, again, if someone is experiencing IBD or has that diagnosis. Page 4, we have more pathogens. So we have more of the protozoa like Blastocystis hominis, Dientamoeba fragilis. We have the worms on page 4 as well. And then we have these additional intestinal markers. So I love this section because it gives you some more clues about what else is going on in the gut, other areas that may need some support besides just the microbes themselves. So this is looking at, does your pancreas make enough digestive enzymes to break down the proteins, fats, and carbs? Are we seeing fat maldigestion issues? Is the gut inflamed? How is that gut immune system working? Do we have blood in the stool? Are we seeing that there's an immune reaction against gluten? Or there's this enzyme called beta-glucuronidase where, when we think of the hormones too, beta-glucuronidase can play a big role. If this enzyme gets elevated, you may start to recirculate estrogen and it could build up to higher levels causing estrogen dominant symptoms, PMS, breast tenderness, heavy clotty periods. So we don't want to see that getting too high either, or again, we have some issues. And this basically is interfering with, if you think of estrogen detox in like 3 phases, this interferes with phase 3 detoxification of estrogen, how you're actually eliminating it from the body. So that's kind of the report. Those main 4 pages are, most of the markers there. And then we also have a 5th page that has some antibiotic resistance genes. So for doctors that like to prescribe for H. pylori or maybe, bacteria, we do test these organisms for bacterial resistance genes to help guide the doctors in treatment using antibiotics, which are better choices or not so great choices.
Great. Yeah, and I want to say I linked in the chat here to a sample report. It's a little bit back there now, but it says diagnosticsolutionsLabs.com, and then there's a link there. it may work if I put it up. I'm just happy that everything's working right now. And, you can always kind of explore some of our resources in the shop as well. It sounds like few people have gotten results, but maybe not, didn't get interpretation of it or didn't get a good protocol put together. So that is a service we offer as well. It's called Past Labs Review. It's actually one of our kind of more popular services because there's a lot of people who are getting their hands on testing, but they're not really still getting the plan. So you can even bring in your old GI map or another lab test. I prefer to see your old GI map because it's my favorite test. And you can bring in some, blood labs or other tests that you've had. Some people bring in their food sensitivity test or a mold test they had. So it's a super valuable service to kind of hear, our interpretation of your results. So that was one question that came through. Lisa, let's see, SJ, I believe, asked some questions about some type of testing. So he sees terms like whole sequencing, metagenomic analysis, 6S sequencing. I don't know if you see this in the chat, metra, transcriptome sequencing. And he's wondering, like, what's the difference and what do you use?
Yeah. So the GI map is qPCR, that quantitative PCR. Now, the other ones are also doing DNA or RNA analysis, but they're a little different. So those are the metagenomics and metatranscriptomics. Now, for me, I like the qPCR for several reasons. One of the important reasons is it reports absolute values. So again, talking like H. pylori, we can say there were 10 H. pylori cells detected per gram of stool. Those other reports, what they report in is relative levels. So it's like, what percentage was this microbe found relating to the whole, being, this versus 100%. Now, this is very hard to interpret, and the data, like when you're trying to do repeat testing, it can get a little skewed because say we're looking at something like, lactobacillus, and we want to know, did we actually improve our lactobacillus levels? Say we've been really working on our diet and everything else, we want to know, did they go up? Well, with our test, we can go, okay, there were this many cells of lactobacillus found in the first test. There were this many cells found in the second test. We can do a great direct comparison and go, yes, it did go up. There was an improvement. Versus those other tests, if they're looking at the relative levels, lactobacillus, maybe your lactobacillus stayed the same or went down, but the percent actually went up because it's comparing that in relation to how the other species in the gut moved. We're assessing it independently, not as, part of the whole. So say if you had something else, say you took some antibiotics or something else and it really affected other levels, that percentage is going to change, not because that particular microbe changed, but because other microbes changed. So that's, for me, a downside of those kind of tests, but also they can't measure very low levels of organisms. Again, I always come back to H. pylori because I had H. pylori and suffered terribly from it for over a couple decades. So I was having ulcer-like pain in the 7th grade. So that's something that,
I was the same. I had an ulcer in junior high. We were ulcer buddies.
Yeah. And I was drinking my cabbage juice and doing, my Lanta and all that horrible stuff, and, didn't know about the functional medicine testing and the lab tests and everything else. It took another 20 years before I tested myself and went, oh, H. pylori, well, now this makes sense. Well, H. pylori is not something that's in very high quantities in the stool again. So we can go down to those 10 cells. A lot of those tests, they can't measure those low level organisms. So, if a bacteria is present at like 0.001% or something, or like H. pylori, I mean, with they're a very small percentage of the whole, they're going to get major drop off, and they just can't count they can't find those very well. And so I want to know about these really relevant organisms that maybe they're not that plentiful, but, as, symptoms go, they can actually cause some really severe symptoms even at these low levels.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm still trying to learn it all too. I have another little GI map presentation, and in my amateur way, I try to compare the different types of PCR testing. It is confusing. One I'd love for you to compare against, Lisa, and then I'll take more questions, is the Viome, which is,
Mhm,
I think it's pretty easy to get your hands on, kind of over-the-counter test. I actually
mhm.
think it may be improving a bit because I saw someone's recent Viome and I was happier with the recommendations than I had been in the past. But to me, it's still a very different test than the GI map for a lot of reasons. I wonder if you could kind of explain that because that's still a question I get a lot.
Sure, yeah. And if someone really wants to geek out on the science, Diagnostic Solutions Lab, the lab that offers the GI map, they just recently created a methodology guide, and that can be downloaded from the website underneath the resource library. So that will give a little more kind of head-to-head comparison of the different testing methods.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, the Viome is a meta-transcriptomics test. So again, it's going to be reporting the relative levels. So again, you're looking at percentages of the whole. Again, they can't measure those very low levels of organisms. They include some that maybe aren't as clinically relevant either. I mean, yes, maybe they show more organisms, but with the GI map, you know, every organism I look at on the report, it's like, we know different reasons, you know, why might this particular one be high or low? How do I raise it? How do I lower it? You know, what are some symptoms we may see? You know, these are things where you can search PubMed and you can find these things out. You know, they've been well researched. We know that they're important for human health, whether it's a negative effect or a positive effect. You know, some of these other organisms that, you know, it'll show up on one of those reports and it'll say, well, this was high. Well, it's like if you try to find out anything about it, it's like, well, we don't know if this is important that it's high. You know, does it cause harm when it's high? You know, how do we lower it? We don't know. So for me, again, I want something as a clinician that's going to have the most clinically relevant organisms on it. And, you know, by those lab tests' own admission, those are not considered diagnostic tests. The GI map is classified as a diagnostic test, meaning that, you know, each analyte on the test has been individually validated. And so they know without a doubt that, you know, that organism really is, you know, it's been validated that it's positively there. And so we know that it is that. You know, the lab is running testing to show, you know, they'll test samples that we know have an organism to make sure that, you know, it can confirm that that is there. Or they'll run a sample that doesn't have the organism so they confirm it's not there. And so, you know, when you're looking for insurance coverage or, you know, what's more, you know, validated, what's diagnostic, again, I want something that's going to tell me that an organism is absolutely there, it's clinically relevant, you know, and that's where that qPCR technology for me wins out.
Yeah, and I'll kind of give my impression on all that is, you know, the to me this is a clinician's test. Like you cannot order it. I don't think you can order direct from you guys, or can you?
No, it has to be ordered by a practitioner. So if there are
Yeah.
any practitioners listening, you know, you can go, you can give the lab a call, you can go to the website, you can, you know, set up an account to order. But for patients, that they have to find a doctor that can order it for them.
Yes. So I would prefer that to be us if you're listening. It's just so different because whereas these home ones, and I'm saying Viome because it's kind of popular right now, and it does give you, you know, some interesting diet tips and stuff, but it can't tell you like what herbs to go take for H. pylori or if you have a parasite or, you know, it gives some
Mhm.
interesting insight into your microbiome and maybe your diet, but it's just a completely different beast than getting this kind of clinical test and then like a clinical
Mhm.
plan. So if you're dealing with more like real chronic illness, to me, you really just have to pick this test. Like biome is like a nice, fun, like curiosity kind of test. Like maybe you're fairly healthy and you're getting into paleo diet and you want to like know more, whatever. But no, it's not the same. So
Mhm.
hopefully we've made that pretty clear. Let me come in here, take some more questions. So Karina, and I think I'm messing up her name. she said if her anti-gliadin is high on the test, even though she's strictly gluten-free, what is that saying?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, for me, again, gluten was a big issue for me. Going gluten free like 12 or so years ago completely put my Hashimoto's in remission. So, this is something I always check my antibodies and make sure that things are staying good. I do a lot of testing with the Wheat Zoomer test from Vibrant America, which is a very comprehensive gluten sensitivity test. And so I'll compare, clients who have run both the GI map and the Wheat Zoomer. And so I've looked at the levels between the two, and based on that, I don't like to see anti-gliadin on the GI map above 100. For me, that is
Mm.
showing that there's exposure and some reactivity by the immune system. Now, I was shocked when I ran a wheat zoomer on myself. I mean, this is a number of years back, but I had high antibodies. And I thought, well, the test must just be wrong. I have been gluten-free strictly 100% for like 10 years at the time. I never cheat. I look at my labels religiously. I mean, there's just no way gluten is coming into my diet. My house is gluten-free. Well, then I bought this little device called NEMA. It's NIMA. And the NEMA sensor, basically you put a pea-sized portion of the food in a capsule. The capsule pops in the device. About 3 minutes later, it'll tell you if it found gluten or not. So I started testing all the
Oh,
foods I was eating. And an organic cinnamon powder that's ground fresh by the company, there's no gluten in their facility, came up positive. So they couldn't explain it. I don't know how it got in there, but I completely cut out that cinnamon. 7 months later, I retested my antibodies, completely gone. And I've done this with a lot of spices. Just the other week, I tested an organic curry powder. Again, you look at the ingredient list, it's beautiful. There's half a dozen spices, all organic. It's a great company, tested positive. And so that's what I often find with people. It does take at least 3 to 6 months to clear those gluten antibodies once you stop 100%. So first I make sure, if they're still having the antibodies elevated, how long ago did they go gluten-free? Or how long has it been since the last, oops, I had an exposure, whether it's intentional or unintentional? If they've been, I don't know of any of exposure, and it's been 1 year, 3 years, 5 years, if you're still above 100 there, it's coming in someplace. Whether it's your shampoo has some hydrolyzed wheat in it, or you're feeding your dog regular dog food and your dog gives you kisses and it's been eating gluten, or your husband or significant other is kissing you and has been just finished a burger with a bun that had gluten. Or it's something you're eating, your spices, your herbs. I had one patient where it was almonds. He went through again, I recommended the NEMA, he tested his bag of almonds, and that's just a single ingredient food, almonds, bagged almonds, and tested positive. So he stopped eating those and his migraines almost instantly went away. And so again, some of these simple foods that don't have long ingredient lists that are somehow contaminated. So that's why I often think, in 9 out of 10 times, when we get the NEMA and start testing foods, we find something. I've only had, I think, 2 cases where the NEMA could not find something. And in both cases, I suspect cross-reactivity. One person loved their corn tortilla chips, and corn
mm.
is a cross-reactive food. Another person had recently started a prebiotic that had corn-derived and dairy-derived ingredients. So again, both of those are cross-reactive foods. But I only go
Oh.
there if we first looked at the gluten contamination directly, eating out foods that you're eating, especially spices.
Very interesting. Yeah, so much contamination. I knew about like gluten-free grains, but I did not know about things like spices. Do you think, Lisa, as people develop a healthier gut and kind of regulate their immune system, work on other infections, that sort of hyper reaction can go away?
Yeah, gluten is one of those tricky foods, like, Dr. Tom
Yeah.
O'Brien, in his books, he's really the gluten guru here. In his books, he says, gluten is the only food that we know of that the body creates these memory B cells to, which means that it will never forget its reaction. Other foods like say blueberries, you have a leaky gut, you have all this dysbiosis, the immune system starts to recognize blueberries as an enemy and attack it. You start healing your gut, you clean up your gut, you stop eating blueberries temporarily, you can often reintroduce the blueberries. But gluten is one of those foods, once you've crossed that line, you've crossed the point of no return. Your immune system will remember. So whether you've been gluten-free for 1 year or 30 years, the second you eat gluten, the body will automatically turn on the production of those antibodies again and create the reaction. So again, it's the only food we know of, but it is one of those that, once you are producing those antibodies, it's often too late to go back.
Okay. Well, that's sad, but helpful. And I always tell people too, like, because they're like, well, we've been eating, red for so long and but it's just different nowadays, right? It's not like the first, this isn't like 500 years ago or 2,000 years ago or anything. That our food quality is so different. Our exposures are so different. The way gluten is sort of, what's the word? Not manufactured, but bred to act a certain way and have a longer shelf life. It's so different.
Exactly. And that's what Dr. Tom O'Brien says too. He says, gluten has always been a mild toxin. So the human body does not possess the necessary enzymes to fully break down gluten. So there was always this minor toxicity issue with it. But because of the toxic world we now live in, we're already up to our necks in toxins. And so we have so much toxic exposure already overburdening our body that having this mild toxin on top of that is just too much. And so nowadays people are having more reactions to gluten because we already have this pre-existing toxicity issue and we can no longer handle a mild toxin coming into the diet.
Oh, yeah, that's a great way to explain it. And sometimes I think we need to kind of frame it different ways because we have this emotional reaction that like we don't want to have to be different than everyone else or like lose out on certain traditions, which is fair, right? Food is part of culture. But we also have to analyze our current culture and like we're not in the best shape. So we can't just kind of just go with the flow anymore. We kind of have to go against the flow to stay healthy. So well, Lisa, I so much appreciate your time. I know we have a few more questions, but I wanna wrap up, and hopefully we can have you back on a day I'm in my proper home office, so all the things. So I appreciate everyone's patience. At least I got my audio going through my cell phone.
Yes.
But yeah, hopefully we'll just kind of concentrate on the audio, and we will play this again on YouTube, and we'll share the replay so you have that opportunity. Just to wrap up, we have every time we highlight a test, we also put it on sale, and it always includes a consultation. So the GI map is $50 off through this Sunday. That's August 2nd. And if you purchase it by then, you also get included in our bonuses that are going out this month with our first round of subscriptions. So we have subscription supplements in the shop, but in case you're like, hey, I want to actually back up and run my GI map before I purchase things, we'll just roll you into all the same bonuses. So you'll get a chance to ask me questions in the bonus sessions we've got coming up, and you can ask us through our email if you have any questions about the testing or the bonuses. I put that link again here in the chat, and it's pretty easy. You just order it online, we send you a kit, you take it at home, you mail it back. Only if you're out of the US, contact us specially because you can't order through that link. You've got to do some special mumbo jumbo if you're outside the US. Lisa, I'm so glad we reconnected. I definitely think we could talk for another 3 hours about all this. So maybe we can bring you on for some more specific topics. As we
sounds
go.
Good. Yeah, I love talking about all things gut related, pathogens. I mean, you name a pathogen on the GI map, I've personally had it. Other than some of the worms, I've only had one of those worms. So, but I love talking about this stuff because I've lived through it firsthand. So I certainly empathize with anybody who's going through this and dealing with these gut infections.
Yeah, it might be fun to come back and just do some case studies and compare notes. And I love talking about the mold gut connection and the different infections you become like susceptible to. So those, you know, lots of fun topics. It's fun for you and I, this kind of thing is fun, right?
It is, yeah.
Great. Well, yeah, you were getting some great feedback in the chat. Appreciate you guys being on here and being patient with me being in this cabin. Thanks so much. Yeah, the bonuses, I will put that in the chat here as we wrap up. But I will let Lisa go, and we'll be in touch. And we won't have a second Facebook Live this week, and we'll be back next week as we continue the series. Thanks, everybody.
Okay, thanks again for having me.